Volume is the amount of space that a three-dimensional figure takes up. To find the volume of a rectangular prism, you use the formula length times width times height. To find the volume of this rectangular prism, we are going to use our formula, which is length times width times height. So we see that our length here is 6, our width is 3, and our height is 4. So we're going to multiply 6 times 3 times 4. And when we multiply 6 times 3 times 4, we get 72. Volume is measured in cubic units, so this is 72 centimeters cubed. For this rectangular prism, I have a length of 7.5, a width of 4, and a height of 2.5. So to find the volume, I will multiply 7.5 times 4 times 2.5. And you can use your calculator for this. So when I multiply these, I get a total of 75 inches cubed. So that means that this rectangular prism has a volume of 75 inches cubed. I also can say that if I had cubes that were filling this rectangular prism and each cube had a side length of 1 inch, then it would take 75 cubes to fill this prism. For this rectangular prism, I notice that I have a length of 5 1/3, a width of 2/3, and a height of 1 1/3. To find the volume, I'm going to multiply 5 1/3 times 2/3 times 1 1/3. So when I multiply this, I can use my calculator. If you're not familiar with using your calculator, you also should know how to do this by hand. If you have mixed numbers and you're multiplying or dividing with fractions, you have to make sure that they are turned into improper fractions first. So for this, I would multiply 3 times 5, which is 15, and then I would add 1, which is 16, and I would keep my denominator of 3. This is not a mixed number, so I can leave it as 2/3. For 1 1/3, I would multiply 3 times 1, which is 3, and then add 1, which is 4, and I would keep my denominator of 3. Now, when multiplying with fractions, we multiply numerators times numerators and denominators times denominators. So I would multiply 16 times 2, which is 32, and then 32 times 4, which is 128. For my denominators, I would multiply 3 times 3, which is 9, and then 9 times 3, which is 27. If I try to simplify 128 over 27 by dividing, I'm going to get a decimal that is repeating, so this does not terminate. So instead, I can write this as a mixed number by dividing, and if I divide 128 divided by 27, I know that 27 will go into 128 4 times. 4 times 27 gives me a value of 108, and when I subtract 128 minus 108, I get 20. Now, I don't have anything left to bring down, so this as a mixed number would have a whole number of 4, a numerator of 20, and the denominator would remain 27. 20 27ths cannot be simplified, so I would leave it just like this. So it's 4 and 20 27ths centimeters cubed. For this problem, I'm given the volume of 22 1/2 inches cubed, and I need to use that to find the value of x. So if I look at my formula, which is volume equals length times width times height, I don't know the length here, but I know that the width is 1 1/2 and the height is 3. So I'm multiplying length times 1 1/2 times 3. Well, I can combine my like terms of 1 1/2 and 3 by doing 1 1/2 times 3, which gives me 4.5, or 4 1/2. So this is 4½ times length. Now I also know that my volume is 22½ so I can plug in 22½ for my volume. So my real equation will say 22½ equals 4½ times my length. Because I want to find out what length is, I need to isolate the variable L. And right now 4½ is being multiplied by my length, so to isolate it, I'm going to use the inverse operation, which is dividing by 4½ which I need to do on both sides of my equation. These are going to cancel and leave me with L. And on this side, I have 22½ divided by 4½, which gives me a length of 5. So X is equal to 5 inches, or this rectangular prism has a length of 5 inches. Next, I see that a rectangular prism has a length of 3, a width of 2, and a height of 5. If Fiona is filling the prism with ½ centimeter cubes, how many cubes will she need to use? Well, for this, the first thing that I want to know is what is the volume of this prism, because I need to know how much space is being taken up by the prism. So I'm using my formula length times width times height. So I'm multiplying 3 times 2 times 5. 3 times 2 is 6, and 6 times 5 is 30, so I know that this prism has a volume of 30 centimeters cubed. Now, I also know that Fiona is filling the prism with ½ centimeter cubes, so I need to know how many cubes she would need to use. If the whole prism has a volume of 30 centimeters, I need to figure out what is the volume of just one of my cubes. Well, if it's a cube, I know that every side is the same. So when I do length times width times height for this, all of these values will be 1/2. So it will be 1/2 times 1/2 times 1/2. When I multiply 1 times 1 times 1, I get 1. When I multiply 2 times 2, I get 4, and then 4 times 2 gives me 8. So the volume of just one cube is 1/8 centimeters cubed. To figure out how many of those will fit in here, I can divide my volume of my larger rectangular prism by the volume of my small cube. So I'm going to divide 30 by 1/8. Remember that when I'm dividing by fractions, that's the same as multiplying my dividend, which is 30, by the reciprocal of my divisor, which is 1/8. The reciprocal of 1/8 is just flipped 8 over 1, or 8 over 1 is equal to 8. So this is the same as saying 30 times 8, or 240. This means that Fiona needs to use 240 cubes. Next, I see that I have an aquarium, and I know that the aquarium is 90% filled with water. So if I need to know the volume of the water in the aquarium, the first thing I need to know is the volume of the entire aquarium. So I'm going to use my formula, length times width times height. So the length here is going to be 6, the width is 2.5, and the height is 4. So I'll multiply 6 times 2.5 times 4, and that gives me a volume of 60 feet cubed. Now, I know that this is not all the way filled. So if it were 100% filled, I know that this would have a volume of 60 cubic feet. However, I know that the water only comes up to 90% of the way full. So to figure out the volume of the water, I need to figure out what is 90% of 60 feet. Well, I can use my percent formula, which we've talked about before, which is part over whole equals percent over 100. In this case, I know that the whole value, or the whole volume here, is 60 feet cubed. I know that this represents 100% of the volume of the aquarium, And I know that I'm looking for 90%, so I'm going to put 90 here. What I don't know is what 90% equals. So I'm going to set up a proportion that looks like this. To solve my proportion, I can look at this and say that to get from 60 to 100, I would multiply, and I would multiply this by 1 2/3. Or that's the same as dividing 100 by 1 2/3. So to get from 90 to x, I would have to divide 90 by 1 2/3. Now, if I divide 90 by 1 2/3, I'm going to have to use my rule. First thing I need to do is make sure that this is an improper fraction. So to make 1 2/3 into an improper fraction, I'm going to multiply 3 times 1, which is 3. 3 plus 2 is 5. So this says 90 divided by 5/3. Now I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So I'm going to multiply 90 by the reciprocal of 5/3, which is 3/5. When I'm multiplying this and I have a whole number, I can put 90 over 1 so that I can solve this. Then I'll multiply straight across. 90 times 3 is 270. 1 times 5 is 5. So now I have 270 over 5. And when I divide 270 by 5, I get 54. This means that 90% of the 60 feet cubed is going to be a volume of 54 cubic feet. So the water in the aquarium has a volume of 54 feet cubed.